Sound. So what is sound? Probably a good thing to think about when talking about EQ. I suppose in its simplest form, you could say that sound is a set of vibrations traveling through the air. Like if you play a flute, you're vibrating the air. Or if you strum a guitar chord, right? You're vibrating the strings, which in turn are vibrating the air. Or when speaking, what are your vocal cords doing? Well, they're vibrating, right? So vibrations traveling through the air are picked up by your ears, and you hear a sound. So is there a limit on the sounds we can hear? And the answer is, yes, there is. Turns out the range of human hearing is well understood. We can hear frequencies as low as 20 hertz to as high as 20,000 hertz. So you might be wondering, what is a hertz, right? Well, hertz is the unit of measure we use for frequency. And it's like this. The number of vibrations or sound waves occurring within 1 second is the number of hertz. Yeah, so it's kind of like when you go to the doctor, right? Nurse comes in, takes your blood pressure, and then does two things, right? She grabs a hold of your wrist and looks at her watch. So what is she doing? Well, to get your heart rate, she is counting the number of pulses she finds in 1 minute. And that's the same kind of idea we have for measuring frequency. But instead of heartbeats in 1 minute, we count the number of vibrations occurring within 1 second. And this is what the chart is illustrating, right? A frequency with 1 vibration per second is 1 hertz. A frequency with 1.5 vibrations per second is 1.5 hertz. A frequency with 3 vibrations, 3 hertz, and so on. So you might be wondering, where did this term hertz come from? So it turns out there was a physicist named Heinrich Hertz, and he lived in the 1890s, and he is credited with proving the existence of electromagnetic waves. So the unit measurement for frequency was named hertz in his honor. So this is a screenshot of the EQ graph from Audacity. Now, I actually started out with GarageBand, but switched over to Audacity because it runs on Mac, Windows, and also Linux, and is also freeware. And just so happens I do my pre-production stuff on Windows, then use iMovie to make the final cut. So at this point, for my needs, Audacity was a good fit. Maybe later on I'll look at Pro Tools or Studio One. We'll see. So let's walk through the graph. One of the first things that jumps out is that the lower and upper bounds on the horizontal axis are the same frequencies from the range of human hearing, right? Makes sense. Sometimes you'll hear the phrase frequency spectrum. Now, this usually refers to the entire horizontal range from 20 hertz to 20,000 hertz. And you'll notice different instruments will resonate in different places along the spectrum. For example, a bass guitar will resonate toward the low end of the spectrum, whereas a violin will resonate toward the high end of the spectrum. Now, the vertical axis measures volume, which is measured in decibels, lowercase d, uppercase b. Now, on the vertical axis, one of the first things that jumps out is this 0 dB. Now, what does that mean? Okay, well, 0 dB does not stand for zero sound or no sound. 0 dB is the volume you establish when you record your track, or the raw recording. And with EQ, you can lower or increase volume on the frequencies, and you can do this to your heart's desire, right? Which turns out to be kind of a double-edged sword, as it's easy to make a recording sound worse. It takes a lot of skill and practice to make it sound better. So, for example, if you were to increase the volume of certain frequencies by 12 dB, you would be increasing the volume to be 12 dB above the volume of the raw recording. In the same way, if you were to decrease the volume of certain frequencies by 21 dB, and that notation would be negative 21 dB, you would be decreasing the volume to be 21 dB below the volume of the raw recording. So let's take a look at bass and treble frequencies. the sounds from the bass guitar are going to resonate toward the low end of the spectrum, mostly between 20 and 500 hertz. And we can expect the violin to resonate toward the high end of the spectrum, mostly between 500 and 20,000 hertz. All right, so my wife and I do a little bit of traveling, and we'll often need to rent a car. So let's say we went from, maybe Hertz, okay? So now the first thing I do when I get into a rental car is I play with the radio, because most likely the settings that the last guy used are not going to be the ones that, I want to hear. So I'll play with the bass and treble volumes until I get a sound that I'm happy with. Now, when I'm playing with the bass control, I'm actually adjusting the volume of frequencies that we find on the low end of the spectrum. And when I'm playing with the treble control, I'm actually adjusting the volume of frequencies we find on the high end of the spectrum. And this is kind of what EQ does, right? So you could say that car radios are built with an EQ that happens to have two frequency bands, namely bass and treble. Now, unlike a radio that normally has two bands, an EQ may have 3, 4, 5, 7, even 10 bands. For this video, I chose to illustrate an EQ with 7 bands. So a 7-band EQ looks like this. There are 2 bands in the low end, sub-bass and bass, 2 bands in the high end, presence and brilliance, and 3 bands in the middle range, low mid, mid, and upper mid. Now, an EQ gives you the ability to adjust volume on frequency bands, as well as adjusting volume on specific frequencies. And a side note on the terminology, you may hear variations of these terms. Sometimes folks will refer to the mids, meaning the 3 middle bands, and sometimes folks will refer to the high end, meaning the 2 upper bands, and so on. So just something you should be aware of. So this is an EQ graph that I actually used on a recording of an acoustic guitar. Now, unlike the bass guitar and violin, they mostly resonate at opposite ends of the spectrum. An acoustic guitar will resonate across the spectrum, in the low end and the high end. And the reason for this is, on an acoustic guitar, the top 3 strings produce low frequency sound, and the bottom 3 strings produce high frequency sound. So when you strum a guitar chord, the sound will resonate in the low end of the spectrum as well as the high end of the spectrum. Now, the first thing I did was to make a cut at the low end of the spectrum, and this was a cut in the sub-bass and bass ranges. The next cut I made was to reduce the volume right on 300 hertz. 300 hertz is a frequency in the low mid-range. Now there's a term for when you're cutting the volumes. In the audio field, this is called doing subtractive EQ. Now, often folks do subtractive EQ before they start boosting volumes. And like most things in the audio field, this is not a hard and fast rule, but I think it's safe to say that it's a common practice. I mean, sometimes I think sound engineers are a lot like gourmet chefs, right? Basically a lot of the same ingredients, kind of the same tool set, but man, there is a real variety in how you prepare, the meal. Now, the last thing I did was to boost volume at the high end of the spectrum. So you might be wondering, how did I know to make these specific changes? Well, the answer is this is just something you need to learn. Get familiar with how different instruments resonate across the spectrum. Listen and watch how various sound engineers do EQ, and then just keep playing around and keep practicing. Applying EQ is a learned skill. It's not an easy skill, but it's learnable. It also really helps to have really good hearing. So here are the main takeaways. The range of human hearing is well understood to be between 20 Hz and 20,000 Hz. The frequency spectrum can be organized into various bands. With EQ, you can adjust the volume of an entire frequency band, or you can adjust the volume of a specific frequency. and it's a common practice to do subtractive EQ before boosting. All right, so how about a demo? So this is the EQ graph I developed for the demo. After listening to the demo track, I felt like there was too much sound in the low end. So my goal was to cut the low end and then boost as needed. I have found that it's really helpful to have a goal in mind before you start. But then after cutting the low end, it sounded like I had removed, too much. So I decided to boost in the bass and upper mid. Now you'll notice I put the raw recording in the first track. The second track will have the EQ effect. I'll start the playhead in the second track and then toggle to the raw recording. Now you may notice a subtle difference between the two tracks. So all right, with that, let's start. Now keep in mind, I'll be applying other effects to the track, right? And, there are so many options. Compression, normalization, saturation, reverb, amplify, echo, limiter, fading out, fading in. It really is an iterative creative process. No doubt about it, right? So, leave a comment, give me a like, subscribe, and please check out the link below, one of my favorites. And with that, we'll see you next time.